In the middle of the 12th century, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood as one of the most extraordinary and unstable realms in the medieval world. Its capital, Jerusalem, was sacred to three faiths and coveted by empires. Wealth flowed through its ports from Mediterranean trade. Pilgrims crossed continents to reach its shrines. But beneath the riches and ceremony, the kingdom was fragile. It depended on alliances, military orders, imported knights, and constant vigilance against stronger neighbors. To the north and east, Muslim powers were beginning to recover from decades of division. Leaders in Syria and Egypt increasingly understood that the crusader states could be challenged. Into this uncertain world was born Baldwin IV in 1161, son of King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. He received the education expected of a prince: Latin learning, scripture, noble conduct, warfare, diplomacy, and the political realities of a frontier kingdom. William later described how the young prince played with other boys. Baldwin's companions pinched and injured his right arm. Yet the boy showed no reaction. He did not cry out. Physicians and attendants recognized numbness and loss of sensation, signs associated with one of the most feared illnesses of the medieval world: leprosy. For a prince expected to lead armies, negotiate with rivals, and produce heirs, it threatened everything. How could someone born to rule survive when his own flesh had already begun to betray him? In 1174, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost its king at the worst possible moment. Amalric I died after years spent navigating the dangerous politics of the Levant. His death left behind no seasoned warrior heir, no mature statesman prepared to inherit a frontier crown. Instead, the throne passed to his 13-year-old son. Because Baldwin was underage, governance initially required a regent. Miles of Plancy briefly held authority before his assassination. Power then passed to Raymond III of Tripoli. Foreign enemies watched carefully. Among them was Saladin, then still consolidating power, but rising rapidly as the most formidable Muslim leader of the age. Inside the court, factions formed around marriages, inheritances, and future succession. Whoever influenced Baldwin could shape the kingdom. Whoever succeeded Baldwin might command it entirely. Yet the young king was not a passive symbol. Contemporary accounts suggest intelligence, determination, and a clear awareness of his responsibilities. No medieval crown looked more radiant than that of Jerusalem. No crown rested on a more uncertain head. By the late 12th century, the greatest danger facing the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a name already spoken with respect across the Islamic world: Saladin. Saladin was born in 1137 to a Kurdish family tied to military service. He rose through service under Nur al-Din, one of the most powerful Muslim rulers of the age. His first great opportunity came in Egypt. In 1169, he became vizier. By 1171, Egypt was brought back under Sunni rule. Control of Egypt meant immense wealth. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved carefully but decisively. Through negotiation, force, and political pressure, he extended authority over Damascus and later Aleppo. For Jerusalem, this changed everything. For decades, the crusader states had survived partly because their opponents were divided. Saladin threatened to remove that advantage entirely. Across the frontier was Saladin, healthy, mobile, energetic, commanding expanding armies. Inside Jerusalem was Baldwin, young, increasingly disabled, ruling a nervous court. Men who expect a long future often hesitate. Men who know they may have none can become extraordinarily dangerous. In theory, a king like Baldwin IV should have ruled from behind walls, councils, and curtains. Many nobles had practical reasons to keep him from the battlefield. Kingship in the 12th century was not an office exercised only through documents. A king was expected to appear where danger was greatest. Baldwin understood this better than many older men around him. Contemporary chroniclers describe a ruler increasingly affected by leprosy, with growing difficulty in movement. Yet soldiers saw their king among them. Medieval armies were not machines. They were coalitions held together by confidence, fear, pay, faith, and loyalty. A king's presence could steady wavering nobles. There was also a sharper political calculation. If the Franks believed their own king was too weak to lead, why would their enemies believe otherwise? The image itself was extraordinary. A teenage monarch, marked by disease, unable to rely fully on his own strength, still mounted and moving with the army through contested land. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin believed the moment had arrived. He marched north from Egypt with a substantial army, crossing into the kingdom with confidence. Baldwin chose to act. Despite his illness, he left Ascalon with a comparatively small force, including royal troops and contingents of the Knights Templar. This was not a cautious maneuver. It was a gamble. The armies met near Montgisard on November 25, 1177. Baldwin's army had moved rapidly enough to catch Saladin before he was fully prepared for concentrated resistance. Medieval battle was violent confusion at close range. Chroniclers describe the Christian attack as fierce and determined. Saladin's army, surprised and pressured, lost cohesion. Saladin himself narrowly avoided capture and fled south. For Baldwin, Montgisard was more than a battlefield success. It was a direct answer to every doubt surrounding his reign. The victory did not destroy Saladin, nor did it end the larger strategic threat. But Montgisard proved that inevitability is often exaggerated. The victory at Montgisard in 1177 made Baldwin IV famous across the Levant. Yet triumph on the battlefield could not alter the private reality that followed him everywhere. His hands and limbs weakened. Nerve damage reduced control and sensation. Tasks once ordinary for a king, mounting a horse, gripping reins, handling weapons, writing, became difficult or impossible. Sources indicate that Baldwin eventually suffered severe visual impairment, likely blindness in later years. For a ruler whose authority depended on appearing before nobles and reading the mood of a room, blindness was not only physical loss, but political vulnerability. He required assistance in daily life. He had to be guided, carried, or supported. The man who could command armies could no longer command his own body. Kingship can be crowded and lonely at the same time. Everyone around him could see what was happening. Every ceremony displayed it. Some battles are fought to be won. Others can only be carried as long as strength remains. The contest against his illness had changed. It was no longer about victory. It was about how long he could continue to stand. By the early 1180s, the greatest threat to the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer only the army of Saladin. It was the growing instability inside the kingdom itself. At the center of that question stood Baldwin's sister, Sibylla of Jerusalem. Into this tense atmosphere came Guy of Lusignan, a Poitevin noble who married Sibylla in 1180. During campaigns against Saladin, Guy's caution and indecision damaged his standing. Baldwin appears to have lost trust in him. Raymond III of Tripoli remained a major power with his own following. Noble houses weighed loyalty against advantage. Military orders guarded their autonomy. To bypass Guy and preserve continuity, Baldwin had his young nephew Baldwin V crowned as co-king in 1183. It was a desperate but rational effort. Nations often fall on battlefields, but many begin dying long before that. They weaken through faction, vanity, and private ambition. By the final years of his reign, Baldwin IV was still a young man in age, but in burden, he had become far older than his years. Baldwin had grown deeply distrustful of Guy of Lusignan, whose leadership he considered inadequate for the dangers ahead. Yet Guy's marriage to Sibylla gave him a direct path to power. Baldwin no longer fought for glory or conquest. He fought for time, order, and survival after his own death. Wisdom often arrives when time is gone. In spring 1185, Baldwin IV died, likely at about 23 years old. In 1185, at roughly 24 years of age, Baldwin IV died in the city of Jerusalem. His reign had lasted just over a decade. Baldwin had become the only figure capable of holding the kingdom's competing factions in fragile balance. When he was gone, that center disappeared. Within months of his death, the court's balance began to fracture. The rivalry over succession, once suppressed by Baldwin's presence, re-emerged with urgency. A sense of dread settled over the kingdom. Baldwin's illness had long been seen as a sign of vulnerability, but his absence revealed something different. He had been the last barrier, preventing internal division from turning into open crisis. After the death of Baldwin IV in 1185, the fragile balance he had maintained quickly began to unravel. Within a year, the young king Baldwin V was also dead. Power shifted into the hands of competing factions around Guy of Lusignan and Sibylla of Jerusalem. The unity Baldwin had struggled to preserve dissolved. At the same time, across the frontier, Saladin had reached the peak of his power. When internal divisions weakened the crusader leadership, Saladin no longer faced a fragmented frontier. The decisive moment came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. The crusader army was drawn into a catastrophic engagement. Cut off from water, exhausted by heat, it was destroyed. Shortly afterward, Jerusalem itself was taken. The political structure Baldwin had fought to preserve disintegrated within a few years of his death. Over time, Baldwin IV came to be remembered not as a failed king of a lost realm, but as its last fully capable sovereign, someone who ruled under conditions of extreme physical suffering while managing to hold together a deeply unstable state. His life stands as a rare historical example where leadership is defined not by the absence of decline, but by functioning within it. He remains remembered because he complicates simple ideas of power. What if the strongest king in the Holy Land was the one already dying?